A CEO threw a $1,200 invoice on a garage floor and laughed in the mechanic's face. 12 hours later, her own father walked into company headquarters and handed that same man a check for $12 million. Stay to the end to find out why, because the reason had nothing to do with the car. And if you believe honest work deserves respect no matter what it wears, subscribe before we begin. It was 11:43 at night when the woman in the tailored charcoal suit threw the invoice onto the concrete floor of a small garage on the edge of town and laughed. A short, cold laugh that echoed off the steel shelving and the half-lit fluorescent tubes overhead. She looked at the man across from her faded blue jumpsuit, grease under his fingernails. Quiet patience written across his face, and told him flatly that he would not see a single cent of the $1,212 written on that piece of paper. The man didn't argue. I didn't raise his voice, and he didn't reach for the invoice crumpled near her shoe. He unpinned the small metal name tag from his chest, folded it once in his palm, thanked her for her time, in a voice so calm it almost unsettled her, and walked back toward the workbench, as if nothing of any consequence had just happened. 12 hours later, the entire executive floor of Helios Automotive would be thrown into chaos. The company's retired founder, a man whose name still opened doors in boardrooms across 3 continents, would walk through the front doors flanked by 2 lawyers and a driver who looked like he hadn't slept. He'd walk straight past the reception desk, past the startled assistants clutching their coffee, and up to that same mechanic holding a check for $12 million folded neatly in his hand. And in front of the entire leadership team, gathered under the pretense of an emergency meeting no one had actually called, he would say that the money had nothing to do with any car repair. It was payment, he'd say, low and unwavering, for the single biggest mistake his daughter had ever made. The garage belonged to a man named Silas Rowan. 41 years old, a widower who'd buried his wife 6 years earlier and never remarried, never spoken much about the loss, never let the grief show in front of strangers who had no reason to carry it with him. His shop sat at the edge of a quiet industrial road lined with warehouses and shuttered storefronts. No sign out front, no listing in any directory, the kind of place a person only found because someone else had whispered the address first, usually in low and almost reverent tones. There were no flashing lights, no glass showroom, no salesman's smile behind a counter. There was a single roll-up gate that groaned when it lifted a concrete floor, stained by decades of spilled oil, and a man who moved through his shop with the quiet precision of someone who had once built engines for a living and had chosen, for reasons entirely his own, to walk away from every part of that life except the work itself. His clients arrived by referral, by a single name passed from one trusted mouth to another, the way certain valuable secrets are passed only among people who understand what they're worth. On an ordinary gray morning, a flatbed truck rolled slowly up to the gate, carrying a hypercar worth more than $4 million. One of only a handful ever produced its paint the color of wet obsidian beneath the overcast sky. Vivian Ashcroft stepped out of the black sedan that followed, dressed as though she were walking into a shareholder meeting rather than a mechanic's garage on a forgotten street, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete with visible irritation. The car had already passed through 3 separate authorized dealerships, each charging astronomical fees for diagnostics that led nowhere, each returning the vehicle no better than it arrived. Still stalling without warning, still throwing cryptic warning lights across the dash, still refusing to perform the way a machine of its price was supposed to. Silas walked around the vehicle once slowly, his eyes tracing every line of the chassis before he touched a single tool. Then he popped the hood. 3 shops already looked at this, he asked. 3 of your industry's finest, Vivian said. None of them could tell me what's wrong. I'm not optimistic you'll do better. He didn't answer. He plugged in a diagnostic reader that looked older than the car itself, its casing scratched and worn, and watched the numbers scroll past with the patience of a man reading something written in a language only he still remembered. 18 minutes later, he straightened up. Your onboard computer was misprogrammed at the factory, he said. The brain of the car, a flaw buried so deep in the code that nobody thinks to look for it because nobody who wrote that code has ever actually built one of these engines by hand. That's absurd, Vivian said, arms crossed. This car cost more than your house. It was assembled by specialists. Then the specialists made a mistake. He set the reader down. You can believe me or you can put it back on the truck. She glanced at her watch, then at the phone in her hand, then back at the car. She'd already spent weeks and tens of thousands of dollars chasing a problem no one else could solve. "Fix it," she said in the tone of a woman granting a favor. "I'll wait." She stood near the doorway, checking her messages every few minutes, as though the outside world might collapse without her constant attention. Once, when he asked her to hand him a torque wrench from the bench 2 feet away, she looked at him as though he'd asked her to scrub the floor. "That's what I'm paying you for," she said, and went back to her phone. He reached for it himself without a word and kept working. On the wall above the bench hung a single-framed photograph, a woman laughing on a porch step with a wrench in her hand. But Vivian never looked up long enough to see it, and Silas never mentioned it. Silas spent the next several hours with his head under the hood, rewriting what needed rewriting, line by line, adjusting what needed adjusting with the focus a surgeon brings to delicate and unforgiving work, testing the engine again and again until it ran the way its original designers had intended before greed and shortcuts had found their way onto the assembly line. By the time the sun dipped low over the industrial road, painting the warehouses in long orange shadows, the car started on the first try, idled without a shudder, and roared to life with a sound that made even Vivian pause, half a second before she forced her expression back into indifference. Silas wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better decades, walked to the small metal desk in the corner, and handed her a single piece of paper. On it was one number, $1.220. Vivian looked at the invoice. She looked at him. And she began to laugh. The calculated kind of laugh a person uses to make someone feel small in front of witnesses. "You plugged in a machine for 18 minutes and tightened a few things," she said loud enough for the driver by the sedan to hear every word. "And you think that's worth more than $1,000 of my money?" Silas said nothing. He'd stopped long ago believing his worth needed to be argued for in front of people who'd already decided not to see it. He only watched as she folded the invoice once, then twice, and slid it into her coat pocket. The sound of her laughter hanging in the cold air long after the engine had gone quiet and the last light outside had faded to a deep and unremarkable blue. By the time Vivian returned to the gleaming glass tower that housed Helios Automotive's headquarters, she'd already turned the morning into a story worth telling, polishing it the way she polished every anecdote before delivering it. She stood before a small cluster of junior executives near the elevators, describing the garage as though it belonged to another decade, a relic held together by rust and stubbornness and misplaced pride, and its owner as a man who didn't understand the first thing about the true value of expertise. "A shop like that has no business charging as though it belongs among the certified specialists," she said, and the small crowd laughed along, because laughing along with the chief executive was simply what people did in that building if they wanted to keep their positions. She walked into her office, pulled the folded invoice from her coat, and tore it cleanly in half, then in half again, and let the pieces fall into the wastebasket beside her desk. She pressed the intercom. "That invoice from the garage this morning," she told her assistant. "Do not pay." There was no follow-up call from the garage that afternoon. No angry email, no threat of legal action through some overpriced attorney. Silas Rowan didn't call to argue his case, didn't send a second invoice with harsher language, didn't do any of the things a smaller and more desperate man might have done when cheated out of an honest day's work. Instead, he opened the worn leather logbook he kept on the corner of his desk, its pages soft and curled from years of handling, and wrote down every detail of the repair with the same discipline he brought to everything else. The parts used, the hours logged, the exact diagnostic codes. The precise factory error no dealership technician in the country had ever managed to catch. He filed the entry away neatly the way he filed every job that came through his gate and said only one quiet thing to himself as he closed the book. "I charge for value," he reminded himself, "never for time." And some debts, no matter how long they were ignored, eventually found their own way of settling. 2 nights later, a phone rang inside a quiet lake house, 3 hours outside the city, in a room lined with old photographs and framed patents that told the story of an entire lifetime spent building something from nothing. Arthur Ashcroft sat in his favorite chair with a glass of untouched scotch beside him, the evening news murmuring on a television he wasn't really watching. The call wasn't from his daughter. It came from a member of his personal staff, a woman who still monitored certain accounts and vehicles out of long habit, more than obligation. "Mr. Ashcroft, I thought you'd want to know. The Obsidian hypercar, the one that's been in and out of the dealerships for months. It's been repaired." "By whom?" "A small independent shop on the East Industrial Road. The technician who did the work, the name on the record is Silas Rowan. Arthur set his glass down slowly, his hand steady but his eyes suddenly 1,000 miles away. He'd heard countless names in 4 decades inside the automotive industry, but very few of them still made the back of his neck go cold. He remembered that one the way a man remembers the exact sound of a door closing on something once deeply important to him. 30 years earlier, when Helios Automotive was still a struggling startup with far more ambition than capital it had been. Silas Rowan, then a young and largely unknown engineer, working long nights in a cramped freezing warehouse, who'd quietly rescued the company's first hybrid drivetrain project from total and public collapse. He'd worked through nights no one else on the small team had the patience or the raw talent to survive. Arthur had offered him a leadership position more than once in the years that followed, had tried again and again to bring him back whenever the company needed a mind sharp enough to solve what no other engineer on the payroll could. And every single time, Silas had declined, choosing instead the kind of quiet, unremarkable life most brilliant men never allow themselves. Pull every record connected to that repair, Arthur said. Every invoice, every note, every timestamp, tonight. It didn't take long before he learned exactly what his daughter had done in that small shop days earlier. That Vivian had refused to pay, that she'd mocked the man openly in front of witnesses, that she'd dismissed a debt smaller than the cost of a single dinner at the restaurants she frequented weekly without a second thought. Arthur said nothing more on the phone once the picture became clear. He hung up, called for his private helicopter to be readied on the pad behind the lake house, and told his pilot in a voice that allowed no delay that their destination had suddenly changed. What almost no one at Helios knew, and what Vivian herself had never once bothered to ask about in all her years running the company her father built, was that Silas Rowan had once been considered one of the most gifted mechanical minds of his generation, a man whose understanding of drivetrains and combustion bordered on pure instinct rather than anything taught in a classroom. He'd been offered directorships at 3 separate manufacturers before he turned 30, offers that would have made him wealthy many times over. He turned down every one. He wanted more than anything a life that felt entirely his own. One built around long, quiet hours in a workshop rather than long, hollow hours in boardrooms full of people who cared more about quarterly numbers than the machines those numbers were meant to represent. Arthur still remembered the night that Patton was born. It was February, the warehouse heater had failed, and the whole team had gone home defeated. The hybrid prototype wouldn't hold a charge under load, and the investors were flying in Monday to pull their money. Arthur had come back near midnight to clear out his office and found one light still burning at the far end of the floor. Silas, then 26, sat cross-legged on the concrete beside the disassembled drivetrain. Space heater at his feet and a legal pad covered in equations balanced on his knee. "Go home, son," Arthur had told him. "It's over. We tried." "It's not the battery," Silas said, not looking up. "Everyone's been testing the battery. It's the way the controller decides when to switch. It's fighting itself." He turned the pad around. "Give me the weekend. I think I can teach it to stop fighting." Arthur hadn't understood half of what was on that pad. But he'd understood the look on the young man's face, and he'd gone home and told the investors to move their flight to Tuesday. By Monday night, the prototype held its charge for 6 straight hours. The patent that came out of that weekend carried the whole company for the next 30 years, and Silas had signed the rights over to Helios for the price of keeping his co-workers employed and asked that his name never appear on a single press release. Arthur had argued with him for an hour. Silas had simply gathered his coat and gone home. Everything changed the year his wife passed away, a loss that arrived without warning and without mercy, leaving him to walk through an empty house that had once been full of her laughter. He didn't speak of it, and those who worked near him during that period learned quickly through his silence more than his words never to ask him about it directly. In the months that followed, he closed the door on the brilliant career that had once defined him, turned away every recruiter, and opened a small, unmarked garage where he could work in peace and take only the jobs that mattered to him. Arthur had reached out to him more than once during those quiet years, offering titles, offering equity, offering entire departments built around his expertise. There had been one particular evening years back when Arthur drove out to the lake house alone and sat across from Silas at a small kitchen table. "The company still needs your mind, Silas," he'd said. No engineer we've hired since has ever matched your instinct. Come back. Name your terms." Silas had listened patiently the way he listened to everything. "Some men are built to lead departments, Arthur. Some men are built to fix what's broken with their own two hands. I made my peace long ago with which kind of man I am." Arthur never forgot that conversation. He carried it through every merger and every product launch in the years since, and he quietly instructed his staff without ever telling his daughter to keep a discreet and respectful eye on that small, unmarked garage from a comfortable distance. Never interfering, simply making certain the man who had once saved his company was never in need of anything Arthur could privately provide. It was for precisely this reason that the news of Vivian's behavior struck him with such force. He had spent decades quietly protecting the dignity of a man who wanted nothing from him in return. And in a single careless afternoon, his own daughter had undone that fragile respect without understanding what she'd touched or why it mattered. As the helicopter cut through the darkening sky toward the city, Arthur sat with his jaw set and his hands folded in his lap and said quietly, almost to himself, that his own daughter had just insulted the very man who once saved the company that now proudly bore her last name across every letterhead. It wasn't simply an unpaid invoice that troubled him. It was the unbearable realization that the values he'd spent 40 years building into that company, respect for skill, respect for honest labor, respect for the people who built things with their hands, had failed to pass from his generation into hers, no matter how much money or education she'd been given. Back at the Helios Tower, Vivian was in the middle of retelling her story for what felt like the 10th time that day, embellishing the mechanic's supposed arrogance, a little more with each telling, painting herself as the shrewd executive who refused to be taken advantage of by an outdated shop owner with delusions about his own worth. The junior staff nodded along, some out of genuine amusement, most simply because it was easier to agree with the woman who controlled their annual bonuses. She felt for a satisfying moment victorious, as though she'd personally defended the company's bottom line against a nobody, and she carried that triumph all the way into the executive dining room, where a private lunch had been laid out for senior leadership. The mood in that room shifted the moment Arthur Ashcroft walked through the doors without warning. No assistant calling ahead, no fanfare that usually accompanied his exceedingly rare appearances. Conversations died mid-sentence. Executives who'd spent years hearing legendary stories about the reclusive founder but had never met him found themselves sitting up straighter in their expensive chairs. Arthur didn't stop to greet a single soul. He walked directly toward the table where his daughter sat. And the moment she saw the expression carved into his face, Vivian understood for the first time in longer than she could remember that something was very deeply wrong. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked in a tone that carried the full weight of 4 decades of hard-earned authority for someone in the room to locate a man named Silas Rowan and bring him to the building without delay. And Vivian, for the first time in her adult life, watched her father's famously calm exterior crack open just enough to reveal something she'd never seen in him before. Quiet, controlled, unmistakable fury simmering just beneath the surface. By the time Silas arrived, summoned not by Vivian, but by a personal call from Arthur himself, the entire executive floor had gathered under the pretense of an emergency leadership meeting, though few of them understood what the emergency even was. Silas walked in wearing the same jumpsuit he'd worn in his garage days earlier, unbothered by the polished marble and towering glass, carrying himself with the same composure he brought to every engine he'd ever laid hands on. Arthur crossed the room the moment he saw him, and to the astonishment of everyone at the long conference table, the legendary founder of Helios Automotive lowered his head in a gesture that looked remarkably close to a bow, an act of open respect. No one in that room had ever seen him extend to another living person. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that presses down on a person's chest. Arthur reached into his coat and produced a check already signed, already dated, made out in careful handwriting for $12 million. He held it out toward Silas. The $1,200 was fair payment for an honest repair, Arthur said loud enough for the entire floor to hear. This is something else. This is a debt I've owed for far longer than anyone in this room could imagine, and it has nothing to do with a car parked in a garage across town. Vivian stood frozen near the head of the table, staring at the check, then at her father, unable to reconcile the calm, unassuming mechanic before her with whatever hidden history connected him so deeply to the company she'd spent her entire career trying to prove herself worthy of leading. Silas looked at the check a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he gently pushed Arthur's hand back toward him. "I don't want it, Arthur." "I know you don't. Take it anyway." "I charged what the work was worth. It was paid or it wasn't. That's the end of it for me." Arthur didn't lower the check an inch. "It is not the end of it for me." And it became clear to everyone watching that this was not a negotiation Arthur intended to lose. Then he turned to face the rest of the leadership team and revealed a piece of company history that none of them, aside from a small handful of long-retired engineers, had ever known existed. The man standing quietly in their boardroom, the same man his own daughter had dismissed days earlier as an overpriced tradesman, unworthy of a fair invoice, was in fact the original architect behind a critical patent that had once pulled Helios Automotive back from the edge of total collapse. 30 years ago, Arthur said, his voice tightening with emotion. This company had no money left in its accounts, no investors willing to wait, and no engineer on staff who could solve what had gone wrong with our first hybrid drivetrain. Silas solved it, alone, under impossible pressure. And in all the years since, as that single patent went on generating enormous value across every vehicle line we ever built, he never once collected a cent in royalties, never filed a claim, never so much as mentioned it to a soul. A junior executive near the far end of the table, a woman who'd joined only 2 years earlier, finally found the courage to ask in a small and hesitant voice why none of this history had ever appeared anywhere in the official record, not an annual report, not an archived press release, not even the private files reserved for board members. Arthur answered without hesitation, his eyes still on Silas. "Because he asked me to keep his name out of it." He said credit mattered far less to him than the simple fact that the work had been done and the people who depended on their jobs here had been able to keep them. He paused. "It was the most selfless request anyone has ever made of me. And I've honored it every year since, even when it meant the man responsible for saving thousands of jobs walked through the world completely unrecognized." Vivian felt the floor tilt beneath her. She'd spent her entire life believing, without ever truly questioning it, that her intelligence and her family name were enough to command respect in any room she walked into. In a matter of seconds, standing in that boardroom, that belief collapsed. She realized with a clarity that made her physically sick that she had spent an entire afternoon mocking in front of her own staff the very man whose uncredited genius had helped build the financial foundation her career now rested on. She looked around the table at the faces of executives who'd laughed along with her jokes days earlier, and saw that some of them were deliberately looking away, unable to meet her eyes, while others watched her with something uncomfortably close to pity. Arthur didn't wait for his daughter to compose herself. He turned to face her directly in front of the entire team and announced that her authority over daily operations was suspended effective, immediately pending a complete review of the incident and her broader conduct as chief executive. "And you will apologize to Silas Rowan before the full board of directors," he said in a tone that allowed no argument. "Not quietly behind closed doors, in front of the same people who witnessed your insult." Vivian's voice caught in her throat. No words came out. Silas showed no trace of satisfaction, no flicker of vindication, nothing that resembled the victory lap most people in his position might have allowed themselves. He said only quietly, but clear enough for the entire room to hear, "Respecting the people who do the actual work of building things has never been a cost to any company worth its name. Only an investment some leaders have forgotten how to make." The room fell into a silence so complete that the faint hum of the air conditioning became for a moment the loudest sound anyone could hear. That evening, after Silas had gone and the executive floor had emptied, Arthur found his daughter alone in her office, the city lights spread out behind her through the glass. She was still standing as though she hadn't been able to make herself sit down since the boardroom. "You've never once looked at me the way you looked at him today," Vivian said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded more like a discovery. "I've spent 30 years making sure you'd never have to earn things the way he did," Arthur said. "I think I made a mistake. You grew up believing respect was something the name bought for you. It isn't. It never was. You could have told me who he was before I ever set foot in that garage." "I shouldn't have needed to." He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window. "That's the whole point, Vivian. A man's worth shouldn't depend on whether you happen to know his history. You should have treated him decently because he was a person doing honest work in front of you. That's all it ever should have taken. She was quiet for a long moment. I don't know how to be the kind of person you're describing. Yes, you do, Arthur said. You just haven't practiced. Start tomorrow. In the days that followed, word of what had happened inside that boardroom spread quietly through every level of Helios Automotive, whispered between engineers on the factory floor, and murmured in careful tones among assistants who'd witnessed the aftermath. Vivian stood before the full board exactly as her father had demanded, delivering an apology that felt stiff and rehearsed. At first, then grew steadily more honest as she continued, the weight of genuine shame finally breaking through the polished exterior she'd spent years perfecting. I judged this man's entire worth by the state of his garage, she said, standing in front of people who'd once feared her without question, rather than the depth and substance of his work, and in doing so I very nearly cost this company something no dollar figure could measure. Silas sat near the back of the room, throughout, arms crossed loosely over his chest, his expression unreadable, offering no visible reaction that might have given her the satisfaction of knowing whether her words had reached him. What came next surprised everyone, including Vivian, who'd braced for almost anything but this. Arthur turned to Silas once the room had settled and extended an offer very few people in the entire industry would ever have the chance to receive. The formal position of Chief Innovation Advisor, a role carrying influence and authority equal to the chief executive herself, with full and unquestioned power over every major engineering decision the company made going forward. Silas listened to the entire offer without interrupting, then declined it as calmly and firmly as he'd declined the check minutes earlier. Titles have never interested me, Arthur. They never will, no matter how good they look on paper. He paused. But I'll help you rebuild your technical division from the ground up, bring what I know to where it's needed most, on my own terms, for as long as the work still feels like it means something. Name your condition, Arthur said. One thing, every technician who works under the Helios name, from the newest apprentice sweeping floors to the most senior specialist running diagnostics on million-dollar cars, gets paid fairly and treated with the same basic respect this company so publicly failed to show me last week. Arthur agreed before Silas had even finished speaking, signing off on it as though it were the easiest decision he'd made in years. Vivian changed after that day. Slowly, almost invisibly, at first, the way people change when they've been forced against their own will to see themselves clearly for perhaps the first time. She began spending long hours down in the technical division, something she'd never once done in all her years as chief executive, watching the mechanics and engineers work with an attentiveness she'd previously reserved for board meetings and investor calls. She asked genuine questions instead of issuing sharp directives from behind a closed door. She listened to the answers instead of waiting impatiently for her own turn to speak. Word eventually reached the financial press that Helios Automotive intended to hold a major public announcement, and speculation ran wild across trade publications about what the notoriously reclusive founder and his once untouchable daughter were preparing to reveal. When it came on a bright and clear afternoon, the announcement was not about a flashy new vehicle line or some groundbreaking piece of proprietary technology, though many analysts had confidently expected exactly that. Arthur stood before a room full of reporters and invited guests and announced instead the creation of a $200 million fund dedicated entirely to the training, certification, and fair compensation of technicians across the automotive trade, an initiative built to address the very culture of casual dismissiveness that had nearly cost his own company its most valuable and unheralded asset. He named the fund after the man who'd unknowingly inspired it, calling it simply the Rowan Standard, a name meant to serve as a permanent reminder within the company of the vast difference between a person's title and a person's true worth. Silas stood near the back of the crowded room, throughout visibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, the way a man does when he'd honestly rather be almost anywhere else. Despite everything that had changed so dramatically in such a short time, Silas returned to his small, unmarked garage on the edge of the quiet industrial road, unwilling to let $12 million, a public apology, or an entire company-wide fund named in his honor alter the simple life he'd carefully built in the years since his wife's passing. He didn't buy a larger house with sweeping views or hire staff to manage a fortune he'd never particularly wanted. He didn't trade in his old dependable truck for something flashier. He kept the same unmarked gait that groaned when it lifted, the same worn workbench scarred by decades of honest use. The same unhurried rhythm of days spent solving problems that mattered to the people who walked through his door with nowhere else left to turn. Vivian visited him there more than once in the months that followed, arriving not as the chief executive of a billion-dollar company, but simply as a woman trying quietly and sincerely to understand what it meant to measure a person by something other than the clothes they wore or the office they occupied. On one of those visits, she stood near the entrance a long while watching him work on an ordinary sedan that belonged, as it turned out, to a retired schoolteacher who couldn't have paid a fraction of what the hypercar's repair had cost. She noticed that Silas gave that teacher's car exactly the same attention, the same patience, and the same care he'd given the $4 million vehicle months before. "Why do you bother?" she asked. "You were offered a fortune, and you'll still spend an entire afternoon on a car worth almost nothing." Silas didn't look up from the engine. Every engine deserves to run the way it was meant to run. Doesn't matter what its owner can afford to pay for the privilege. He wiped a fitting clean and set it back in place. "The teacher drove your father's grandkids to school for 11 years. Nobody wrote her a check for that either. Good work doesn't ask who's watching." Vivian didn't have an answer. She stayed until the sedan was finished, and she watched the schoolteacher press both of Silas's hands in hers when she came to collect it. And something in that small gesture reached her in a way no boardroom ever had. She learned slowly and sometimes painfully that the truest measure of value in any industry and in any life had never been the size of someone's title or the shine of their suit, but the depth of their skill and the quality of their character. Two things no amount of money could manufacture. He could. She began in her own quiet way to rebuild the culture of the company from the ground up, insisting that every technician be given the training and respect the Rowan standard had promised. The changes came slowly, and old habits inside a large corporation rarely die without a fight. But those who worked closest to her noticed that the woman who'd once torn up an invoice without a second thought now read every technician's file personally before any decision affecting their pay was made. Months later, on another unremarkable morning, a young man brought his car in for what seemed a routine repair. While Silas worked beneath the raised hood, the young man glanced up, half joking and half genuinely curious. "Hey, are you the guy, the one who got a $12 million check from the founder of Helios?" Silas didn't look up right away. He tightened one final bolt with a practiced twist of his wrench, then wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his pocket. "I'm just a mechanic," he said. "Nothing more, nothing less." And if there had ever truly been a camera there to capture that quiet exchange, it would have pulled slowly away from the small garage, past the roll-up gate rising and falling in its familiar rhythm, past the unmarked spot above the door where a sign had never once existed until the gate finally closed behind him with a low metallic groan, and the industrial road outside settled back once more into its ordinary, unremarkable, and thoroughly deserved silence. Silas Rowan measured a person by the work of their hands, and it cost $1 billion CEO everything before she understood him. Do you think Vivian truly changed or only learned to hide it better? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe the quietest people in the room are often the ones most worth knowing, subscribe. There's another story like this one waiting for you.